We're at a time when the current powers to be, the nation states, they will do and are doing everything in their power to maintain control. But eventually, when all these regulations and oversight, they don't fix the problem, they just make people angrier, well, they'll move to intimidation and violence. They'll demonize and they'll demonetize and they'll make examples of anyone who falls too far out of line. Unfortunately, we're at the cusp of that kind of government control and tyranny right now. Those who control the narrative and the money supply, they control the people. And the current trend we're going to see is more and more tyranny as we go along. And this is due to two main forces, right? The decentralization of media and the decentralization of currencies. These two disruptive technologies are putting increasing pressure on the current nation-state power structure. That's why government control must rise if nation states want to remain in power. Because if a nation state allows decentralization and it does nothing to counteract it, it will quickly devolve and become powerless. And these trends explain why global tensions and conflict and turmoil are all rising, and it's going to continue. The bottom line is, I think government control worldwide is going to be forced to worsen over the coming decades. Hey, I'm Jack, and I'm a co-founder of SkilledSurvival.com and TheResilientLife.com, and I've been sharing my thoughts about survival and preparedness and risk and uncertainty and resiliency online since 2013. So if you like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel right now, because I got lots more of this kind of content coming your way, and I don't want you to miss anything. Because if you go back to the invention of the printing press, you'll see how disruptive that new technology was to that era's Loctite power structure. You see, the printing press was the spark that broke past the government control. This power shakeup, it led to massive chaos and pain and suffering and war. And of course, back in the 1400s, when the printing press was first invented, people didn't use the word government for the ruling class. The ruling class in Europe was a combination of monarchies and the church. And when the printing press came along, it was a brand new technology, and it created over time a wave of decentralization. Before the printing press, the masses, they relied on priests to read and interpret the Bible. Why? Well, for two reasons. Without any printing technology, Bibles were rare. They were also kept under tight control, and most people were illiterate anyway. So even if they got a peek at a Bible, they couldn't read it. So people were forced to rely on the keepers of the Bible to tell them what was in it. Just think about for a second how much control that gave the church and the monarchies. The people would be 100% dependent on a priest's interpretation. And of course, with great power, corruption usually follows. So these Bible keepers, they invented something called an indulgence, which essentially said, you must pay favors to the church and the priests to be forgiven for your sins in order to avoid the tortures of hell. But the printing press disrupted this long-standing power dynamic because over time with the printing press, more written material was created. And so more people found it useful to become literate. And at some point, Bible access was no longer a bottleneck. And the masses, they started reading and interpreting it for themselves. Once this happened, the masses realized that those in power were manipulating what was written in the Bible. Martin Luther was one of the first ones to realize and then explain to the people that the church, what they were telling them was not what was written in the Bible. They weren't the same thing. This is why Martin Luther was so upset when he pinned his thesis to the wall. This was the decentralization environment where monarchies and churches lost control. The existing narrative from that Roman church was challenged by the new narrative, the Protestant church. Now you had two narratives that people had to choose from, and these two narratives became unreconcilable differences. Doesn't that sound a lot like modern politics in the US? And ultimately, this narrative and power shift, it led to Europe's long, horrific 30 Years' War. But the 30 Years' War was horrible, especially for everyday folks. There was famines and there was violence. And this was all brought about by the decentralization of narrative because of the printing press. So what's today's equivalent of the Gutenberg press? The internet is the next phase of decentralization of information. But still, large governments control people and they limit many individual freedoms today. Mostly, we follow their rules whether we agree with them or not, and we pay taxes whether we think it's a good investment or not. Yes, it's way better than having kings and priests decide for you. And the power is more distributed across bureaucratic representation, in theory. Plus, checks and balances, they help prevent any single person or small group from gaining too much control for too long. But with the invention of the internet, the decentralization of narrative is now disrupting this form of government. And this slippage of current government control, it's leading to increased narrative conflicts. And I truly believe over time, this is going to lead to rising levels of totalitarianism because we're in the early stages of a new societal transition, similar to the years after the first printing press. Because monarchies, they didn't just give up their control willingly. Right? After the printing press, they fought that with tooth and nail and ended up in massive wars, right? They were trying to maintain their control with violence because they knew they were losing their grip on power. And any powerful entity in decline being threatened will increase its control over its people to survive. They do this with the following. They do it with new laws, more regulations, more bureaucracy, less privacy, more watchkeepers, and more auditors. And this is exactly what we're seeing today, right? Whoever controls the narrative defines the truth, and whoever defines the truth defines reality. Nowadays, with the internet, anyone, anywhere can talk to anyone else in real time with no limits to the number of people paying attention. Sure, there's still media gatekeepers today, mainly big tech platforms, but these social platforms are being targeted by the government to try to stop the spread of misinformation and disinformation. The government is feeling threatened, and they need to put extreme pressure on these gatekeepers to try to maintain control of the narrative. However, over the long term, with the internet, the march towards narrative decentralization is inevitable. Make no mistake about it, no nation state will go quietly into the night. They will do everything they can to try to remain in power, including violence. Because, quote, the threshold between verbal violence and actual violence is a very fragile fence. I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. Nation states, they've always had some control over the media, right? Even before TV and the internet, it was newspapers and pamphlets. Nation states, they never had absolute narrative control, unlike past monarchies, but they had enough persuasion and influence to keep things in what they would consider a reasonable range, right? And since the information was created and distributed by only a handful of companies, influence was relatively easy. For example, in the US era of broadcast television, there are only 3 major news networks to worry about. And these 3 networks kind of had to keep their narrative in a relatively tight range anyway, for 2 reasons. They had to talk to all Americans, so they couldn't stray too far from the middle without alienating a massive chunk of their audience. And governments, they could influence such a small number of media channels with ease. Then along came cable news. That's when controlling the narrative became more complicated, but it was still possible to some degree. Then the internet came along, and it broke the control of narrative wide open. Now, influence and government control over the narrative is a much more challenging problem, perhaps even futile at some point, because it takes a whole lot more time and effort and resources even to attempt to shape so many opinions at scale. In summary, each of these changes in media, distribution, and consumption, it's led to more and more decentralization of the narrative. More voices means less control and influence for the nation states. Now, I'm not saying whether decentralization here is good in the long term or bad. I lean towards good, but there's pros and cons either way you look at it. What I'm really trying to convey to you is it's gonna happen whether we like it or not. The internet's here. We must learn to live with it. So what are the next steps? What's the future hold? Well, the next steps in decentralization of media, I believe, are the blockchain and Web 3.0. Web 3.0 will allow individuals to control the media they produce 100%. They'll no longer have to bow to the current social media gatekeepers. People will be able to support journalists directly and anonymously. We already see some of these ideas in setups like Substack, but theoretically, Web 3.0 will be even freer and harder to control and influence. With Web 3.0, there will no longer be a middleman who can cancel you if they, or a nation state, don't like or agree with what you're saying. Do you think the government will like that? No way. Web 3.0 means less government control over quote unquote dangerous ideas. But there's just no way that governments around the world are going to be willing to allow this complete narrative control to slip through their fingers, right? Instead, they'll be forced to outlaw any new technology that promotes online free speech and punish any inconvenient ideas by labeling dissenters as terrorists or throwing them in jail. And unfortunately, we're already seeing some of these tactics, right? Because not only do nation states need to battle for narrative control to stay relevant, but cryptocurrencies, they're threatening the nation state's currency control. Bitcoin, Ethereum, Dogecoin, etc. They're not nationally approved currencies, and so far, they're not controlled by the nation states. Now, some nation states are just saying, hey, crypto is no big deal, we're not going to worry about it, it's a small thing. But China, they outright banned it. So they must feel threatened, right? Because Cryptocurrencies are a decentralized way to transact using digital tokens. You can trade and spend these cryptocurrencies without using banks or credit cards. And this is Decentralization 101. It cuts out the traditional finance intermediaries. But for anyone to do that, there must be some reason to trust it, right? Well, with crypto, transactions are recorded as a public record via the blockchain technology. But the blockchain is theoretically a mistake-proof way to decentralize the buying and spending of monies, of currencies, with confidence. Now, of course, with any new technology, there will be issues and there will be growing pains. But if people start shifting from a national currency to cryptocurrencies, well, the governments aren't going to like it. They're going to lose some of their monetary control. Because if people aren't relying on the financial gatekeepers like the big banks to get loans, those interest rate moves won't even matter. Because people today, they can secure loans directly from other non-bank groups via crypto and blockchain technology. Nation states, they use these gatekeepers to control interest rates and to help support or slow down economic activity, right? But with cryptocurrencies, nation states can no longer use these levers to manipulate the value of money. Plus, cryptocurrencies encryption, they may undermine over time the government's ability to track and tax. People may discover that they can avoid or hide much of their income or assets from the IRS. This in turn would reduce government revenues over time. So as you can see, if cryptocurrencies mature and go mainstream, the government, it's going to lose much of its control over finances. And any government in its right mind cannot allow that to happen. They will fight this with everything they've got. Currently, it seems like most governments worldwide are not threatened by crypto yet. But let's say, just for argument's sake, we enter into a period of hyperinflation. Perhaps traditional currencies, they go into a massive decline in value, right? The Russian ruble, the Mexican peso, the US dollar. If that ever is the case worldwide, many people will abandon the sinking ships and they'll move to wherever they can find, and maybe crypto will be the answer. Why? Because anybody facing a wealth destruction of hyperinflation, they may see crypto as the only other option. Such a dire situation may shift the crypto risk-reward equation. And we're already seeing this phenomenon in places like Venezuela. Again, the loss of monetary control by a nation state could be a death sentence to their power structure. This is why the world's governments are going to be forced to clamp down to maintain control. If a government feels threatened, and they're going to lose the narrative, and they're going to lose their monetary control over the populace, they have no choice. They have to enact violence or they have to go away. Which do you think they're going to choose? But just like the printing press, this is not going to be a decade-long thing. This is going to be a century or two type of transition. And history has proven that this transition will be chaotic. And government control and violence, it'll get worse before it gets better. For example, perhaps in the US, we'll see some states succeed from the Union. Now, I'm not saying this is gonna happen, but it sure feels more possible now than it ever has been. And I think nation states that are rooted in democracy, well, they may be forced to model more authoritarian regimes in the not too distant future, because it's due to their built-in respect for human rights and the Constitution and things like that. It may be necessary for these governments to trample on those rights in order to survive. Unfortunately, the modern nation state and individual rights may no longer be compatible. Are we entering into the dystopian Orwellian future written about in the book 1984? That feels more possible today than ever before. So why would you live a life fragile to these types of events? Why wouldn't you make an effort to plan for the troubled times ahead? That's why I think you should start living a resilient life. To me, living a resilient life means acquiring some essential supplies just in case. It's a way to protect you and to smooth out the wild ride ahead. And the first step to living a resilient life is to figure out where you stand on the fragile versus resilient spectrum. How much food do you have? Are you stockpiling enough water? Do you have some basic medical supplies and know how to use them in an emergency? Can you take care of yourself and your family in a crisis? Or will you be forced to take government handouts? Okay, I have a video right here to help you get started. And if you'd like to know more about the other 8 biggest threats to humanity, I want you to check out this video right here. And until next time, prepare, adapt, and overcome.